All right. Great to see you all. And as usual, we're glad that you've joined us. Today we have a lot of ground to cover is what I'll call it. We got quite a few things to do because today is that forms review that we promised you. And so before we jump into the forms, just a couple of quick announcements. For those of you who had a chance or enjoyed the vision boards over in Burlington, we are having the Hillsborough version of creating your vision board. And so if you didn't get a chance to do it in Burlington, come and join us next Thursday at noon. So from 12 to 2, we'll be doing the vision boards here at the Hillsborough office. If you haven't been here in a while, come and see what we've got going on over here and come and make your vision board. All right. Next, glad you asked. On October the 6th, we have a mental health counselor that's going to be joining us. And she's going to talk about mental health and triggers to look for in yourselves and your clients or other agents, and what to do and how to be on the lookout and be aware. Mental health is a growing issue of becoming more aware about what to consider in your real estate transactions and potentially with your clients when we're talking about the importance of recognizing triggers and things like that. So we're excited to have her join us, and that's the next Glad You Asked on Thursday, October the 6th. And any other announcements, Teresa, before we get started?
I don't, well, yes, I will. Commercial. We did commercial training before. The next one is coming. We are not set on the date, but hopefully it will be the very beginning of October. So be on the lookout for that. I'll have that confirmed shortly.
All right. Okay, thank you. So those of you who've been waiting, it's coming. We're working on it. All right. And so today we are going to do an in-depth form review on 4 different forms. We're going to start with the professional services disclosure. We talked last time about why that's important. And we're just going to retouch that form and how to use it, why to use it. Then we're going to talk about the new dual agency section of the agency agreements. And so how to use that, make sure you're not confused because they've changed the formatting a bit. Next, we're going to talk about the WWREA, the new disclosure, and how to use that properly. It's actually to be filled out by agents, but we'll talk through that one in detail. And then finally, in the last half of the GYA today, we're going to talk about some specific sections of the buyer agency and the listing agreement to make sure that you have clear understanding of it yourselves so that you can explain it clearly to your clients. And so there are certain sections that are already highlighted and identified, and we'll cover those as we get into those documents. And so that's what we're going to be covering. It's a lot of ground. We got quite a few pages of forms here. So buckle up your seatbelts and get ready for this ride. And so I'm going to start with sharing my screen and starting with the PSD in DocuSign. And so give me 1 second here, and then I'll be looking for someone to give me a thumbs up if you can see it. Let's see here. All right. Can anyone see the professional services disclosure form? Yes? Okay, great. All right, good. Okay, and so when it comes to this form, you should realize that all of you are required to have this as a part of your documentation in Command. And so how to use it appropriately, what the form is for, and all those things, we're going to just discuss it here as we go over the actual form. So the very first thing on the form here is see the guidelines form 760G for instructions on completing this one. So don't forget all these standard forms that the Association of Realtors has created. There are guideline forms that literally tell you what to put in the blanks. And so if you ever have questions about that, make sure you look up and check out the guideline form on how to use it. All right. Now, the first thing that you'll see is the property address, buyer or seller, real estate firm. And so obviously the property address, if you're working with a buyer, you won't have that necessarily from the very beginning. But as you go along, you would fill it in once your buyer goes under contract and it's time to start having some of these professional services. So again, from the very beginning, you may not be able to fill it out. It's a living document that will need to be filled in as you go along in the transaction. All right. And so starting here, there are professional services that are typically performed in connection with the purchase and sale of real estate. Buyer or seller understands that the firm cannot give advice in certain matters that may relate to the purchase or sale of property, including but not limited to matters of law, taxation, financing, surveying, wood destroying, insect infestation, structural soundness, or engineering. So regarding each professional service listed below, the buyer or seller should either select the service or elect not to have the service performed. With respect to each service selected, indicate who will order the service and the name of the service provider selected by the buyer or the seller. This form should be amended to address additional professional services that are considered after it is first completed. Okay, so it even tells you in the form to update it as things change throughout your transaction. All right. Now, it has a list of standard services that you could be asked to refer someone for, starting from an accountant or CPA or tax advisor. Remember, that is not your lane unless you are a CPA, which most of you are not. Do not try to answer tax questions. So if they ask you tax questions, you can refer them to a tax provider. Again, they can either waive those rights to have a tax provider provide information for them, or they can choose to have someone to guide them in the process. Then you determine who orders it. What do you think goes in this who orders? What are you guys putting in there if you have an option that's selected? All right. What are you putting? Are you putting actual names? Are you just putting agent or client? How are you filling that out? Is anybody using this form?
I put whoever ordered. If I order, I put my name. If the buyer orders, I put the buyer's name. If the transaction coordinator ordered, I put the transaction coordinator name.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Paul. So as it goes along, if it has been selected, then who orders it should be named here, and also the name of the service provider. And so that is the case for every type of service that's listed here. We can, obviously you would want to have appraisal information. That would be ordered typically by the lender when it comes to appraisals. And so it's important to know who is doing the ordering as you go along. And this is a great way to keep track of your due diligence process in the transaction. Notice that the attorney can be selected, a home warranty, different types of inspections, home inspection, HVAC, pool, spa, radon, septic, well, water quality testing, septic testing, radon, wood pest infestation, re-inspections. So now this one is really interesting. Don't forget that if you have an original inspection or an appraiser that requires some work to be done, there may need to be a re-inspection. And so don't forget to add on if re-inspections are required in the transaction, who orders and performs those re-inspections. Also, insurance, if whoever's going to look into getting the quotes for the insurance, property insurance, flood insurance. If the property needs to have a flood insurance certificate, the mortgage loan itself, the survey, and notice that there are several other blanks in the case that your transaction needs some other service provider, maybe mold remediation or environmental, what have you. So you should be using this form actively throughout the transaction and updating it as all of these choices come along. Okay. Now, when it comes to filling out this form, it's important to make sure that as it is updated, that you get new signatures on the form as well. Number 2, buyer or seller acknowledge the firm has recommended the buyer or seller consult with a professional for an opinion regarding each service listed above to be performed pursuant to buyer or seller's purchase or sale of the property. Buyer or seller hereby agree to indemnify and hold the firm harmless from, against any and all liability, claim, lawsuit, or expense that the firm may incur either as a result of buyer or seller's selection and use of the listed service providers, or their election not to have one or more of the listed services performed. This is another reason that you need to make sure your client signs this form, because it is your protection. This is how they are indemnifying you and the firm from the outcome of these inspections, either way, whether they go well or not. Okay, so again, this is for your protection and for the firm's protection. And so again, it's required for that reason. Note regarding radon and other environmental quality issues testing. In addition to testing for the presence of radon, consideration should be given to testing the air and any private drinking well water for the presence of other contaminants, including but not limited to biological, chemical, radiological contaminants. Buyer or seller should consult with an air and or water quality specialist regarding the need for and the scope of any such testing. All right, so I don't know what you guys are out there and saying. You know, I've heard agents say, oh, radon's not a big deal in this area. You don't have to test for that. Well, this form is saying otherwise. It's suggesting that you recommend all testing and let the clients make their decision. So be careful about what you state and make sure to cover in detail what the form actually says. All right, we've got 2 more boxes here, and then we're going to have a brief discussion about this form. There's a note regarding surveys. Situations arise all too often that could have been avoided if the buyer had obtained a new survey from a North Carolina registered surveyor. A survey will normally reveal such things as encroachments on the property from adjacent properties, fences, driveways, etc. Encroachments from the property onto adjacent properties, excuse me, road or utility easements, crossing the property, violations of setback lines, lack of legal access to a public right-of-way, an indefinite or erroneous legal description in previous deeds to the property. Although the title insurance company may provide lender coverage without a new survey, the owner's policy contains an exception for easement setbacks and other matters which would have been shown on a survey. Many such matters are not public record and would not be included in an attorney's title examination. In addition, if the buyer does not obtain their own survey, they would have no claim against a surveyor for inaccuracies in a prior survey. Okay, so again, do not tell your clients that you don't recommend a survey or it's not needed. You should recommend a survey and tell them why they should get one, because if they don't, something that would have been found in a survey will not be covered by their title insurance. Okay, so it's important for you to understand and for you to make sure that your clients are fully aware of the importance of them getting a survey for themselves. They cannot rely on a past survey, and they can't go after an old surveyor. They have to have their own. All right. Other important notes. Although the firm may provide buyer or seller the names of providers who claim to perform services in one or more of the listed areas, the buyer or seller understands the firm cannot guarantee the quality of service or the level of expertise of any such provider. Buyer or seller agrees to pay the full amount due for all services directly to the service provider, whether or not the transaction closes. Again, these are all caps. It's really important that your client understands they have to pay for the services that they order, regardless of whether the transaction closes. Okay, and then this is where everyone needs to sign: buyer, seller, the signature of the individual agent, the firm name goes here. If the buyer or seller is an entity, then you would need to fill out the appropriate entity information here. All right. Any questions before we add a few comments and move on to the next form?
I have a question.
Sure.
So air quality testing, I'm curious, is that something that others are doing on a regular basis? Is that like another one to be adding, or are we talking about that with regard to mold and things like that?
Okay, good question. What are you guys doing when it comes to air quality? Is anyone recommending any other testing other than radon or mold?
I'll be honest, I have never done anything with air quality.
Okay.
Yeah, I hadn't even
Me
thought about
either.
it.
I did it once, and it was because the client had a lung condition. And they needed to test it, and there was a group we called, and I can't remember the name, but it's not something I do regularly either.
All right. Thank you all for chiming in there. When it comes to additional air quality other than radon or potentially mold testing, it's usually based on the needs of the client. So if your client has, again, an example that Natalie gave, maybe lung cancer, or if they have very severe allergies or reasons why they may need to test further, that's something that you should recommend for them according to their needs. Okay. All right. And then one other point that we wanted to make for you when it comes to the professional services disclosure. 2 points. When we had our meeting in Hillsborough, one of the agents shared with us that a strategy for explaining this form and why it's so important is to make sure that your client knows that it's a living document. So if they ever needed to go back and find out who performed any service in their transaction, they would have that information available. So if they are questioning why they have to keep signing it because you have to change it along the way, that's a way to help explain the importance of this form to your clients. Also, at this point, when you're first explaining it in the beginning of any transaction, it's a great opportunity for you to provide a vendor list for your clients to choose from. And so if you don't already have one, begin to put together a vendor list with recommended service providers already there for your client to select from. Of course, we recommend at least 3 options if you can, and have a list of available service providers that they can either choose to use one of those or they can find their own. Mike, I see your hand raised.
Yes. So this is to be used with sellers as well?
It can be. Yes, sir. When
Okay,
it comes to... Mhm.
I've never used it with the seller. I give them the sample copy as directed in the listing agreement.
Mhm.
But I don't, is there ever a need? I guess if they were to do an appraisal or a pre-inspection, maybe, I don't know. But then do you decline all those other, is that how we would work that?
Yes, sir. That is an excellent question, Mike. Thank you. Teresa, do you want to jump in on that one?
Yes, and I was going to say that when working with sellers, I do use it anyway. Maybe it's because I'm an instructor, or I don't know, maybe it's because I've been a BIC since 2008, but just as a CYA for myself, if I do recommend a stager, or if it's a situation where it's an estate and they had to get attorney assistance prior to listing or while listing, I will put that on there and have them sign it, pre-list inspections, all of those. You know, whether or not they decide to get a home warranty or not, I'm going to put that on there as well. So it is a document that can certainly be used with sellers. And I was just thinking, for me personally, it may not be a bad idea to just have them waive all of this stuff at the end. So if something does come up, I'd be covered. I'm not saying I'm going to do it, but it's a thought. It's a thought that just popped in my head, just as a CYA.
Okay. Yeah. So since I've not used it with a seller. I use it with a buyer every time, but not with the seller. It's obviously not required to get paid. And I hate to throw that out there, but it's, you know, doesn't get kicked back for not having it for the seller. So, but I agree, it's probably CYA, covers your assets, right?
Yeah, that's right. And especially if we are requesting or they're asking us for a potential vendor, then
Correct.
if we refer anybody, then that triggers the PSD for the seller.
Okay.
And Mike, thank you for bringing that up. It's not currently required for you to get paid, but we're working on that because it is a requirement from the firm. And so we have to make sure that the proper checks and balances are in place to make it required from your end as well.
Well, I guess we'll start getting them with our sellers then.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Judy, do you have another question?
Yes. So when you say we get it signed repeatedly, is it the actual form with the signature at the bottom, or are you just talking about the columns that say waived and selected where they initial?
Okay, good question, Judy. It would suffice, once you have it signed, if you make a change, it would suffice to have initials with the date of the changes along the way. But there will still need to be signatures, whether it's the signature of the initial changes or if they actually sign. But as you go along, it would be a good practice to have initials or signature and a date of something that changes.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Tiffany. And just real quick, because I know we have to move on. A practice that I do is, instead, I know it's living, so it's living for me, but at the end of the transaction, I will get it signed I'll take it to a final walkthrough right before closing. And at that point, everything's done pretty much. So I'll hold it. I give them a sample and hold it to the very end. And just with that explanation that Tiffany just gave, here are a list of vendors that have performed some type of activity in your transaction. And this is for you to know who did what as it relates to your transaction, and just have them sign it then and there. I heard one agent say that they will take it to closing and give it to the attorney and stick it, and the attorney will stick it right on top of the loan documents, and that will be the form that they sign before anything else. So the signatures are covered there.
Right, but we can't necessarily get through compliance without it on the buy side. So we're just talking about the sales side, but where does the buck stop? I mean, if I've got a guy laying mulch, a person, painting, where does the buck stop? The cleaning ladies, all of them go on the form?
Okay, Natalie, great question. Good question. So when it comes to service providers in your transaction, these are specifically relating to service providers that you are going to recommend. Or if let's say that there's something that comes up or an agreement between buyer and seller according to their contract. If there's something to that effect, then who is the service provider that is performing those duties? Okay, so that's a general guideline to help you to capture the service providers on that form. So if the seller is preparing the house and they want to, put some mulch and all those things, if they're doing that on their own, that's fine. But if they ask you for a referral, then you should include that on the form.
Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? All right, well, I have switched over to our next form. The next thing that we're going to discuss is the new dual agency section of the buyer agency and the listing agreements. So we're just going to go straight to number 14 in the buyer agency agreement, and I'm going to share my screen. Can you all see dual agency, the form for buyer agency agreement? Is anybody seeing that? Yep. Okay, great. All right. And so this is the exclusive buyer agency agreement, although the section is almost identical in the exclusive right to sell listing agreement. So we're going to talk through dual agency. It never hurts to go through that again. It can be a little bit confusing for agents, and also how to fill out this part of the agency agreement. All right, so Teresa, do you want to do a little bit of this reading so I can drink some water, get my voice back?
Is it your goal for me to start at dual agency at the very top?
Mhm.
All right. Talk about dual agency. And before I read, please remember that the agent is the firm. The firm is the agent. Okay. So when it comes to dual agency, buyer understands that the potential for dual agency will arise if buyer becomes interested in viewing property listed with firm. Firm may represent more than one party in the same transaction only with the knowledge and informed consent of all parties for whom firm acts. Very important sentence there. So 14A goes on to say disclosure of information. In the event firm serves as a dual agent, buyer agrees that without permission from the party about whom the information pertains, firm shall not disclose to the other party the following information. Number one, that a party may agree to a price, terms, or any conditions of sale other than those offered. Number two, the motivation of a party for engaging in the transaction unless disclosure is otherwise required by statute or rule. And three, any information about a party which that party has identified as confidential unless disclosure is otherwise required by statute or rule.
All right, so for that first section, thanks, Teresa. That first section there, it's important to know what changes. So when dual agency arises, remember, this is important for you to know and for you to explain to your client that these are the primary changes here. So you will now no longer be able to disclose these things in order to be fair to both sides, okay? And so that's in the case of a dual agency where the firm is now representing both clients. This is regardless of if there are different agents working with both clients. If we're in dual agency, we immediately have to step back and we cannot disclose these things under dual agency, okay? And that's why it's important to know the difference between dual and designated dual, which we'll get there as we keep going along. All right, Teresa, keep going for me. Let's do B and then I'll jump in.
All right, excellent. So we're still on 14, dual agency. Section B says, firm's role as dual agent. If firm serves as agent for both buyer and seller in a transaction, firm shall make every reasonable effort to represent buyer and seller in a balanced and fair manner. Firm shall also make every reasonable effort to encourage and effect communication and negotiation between buyer and seller. Buyer understands and acknowledges that, number one, prior to the time dual agency occurs, firm will act as buyer's exclusive agent. That makes perfect sense. Number two, the buyer is acknowledging in its separate representation of buyer and seller, firm may obtain information which, if disclosed, could harm the bargaining position of the party providing such information to firm. And number three, firm is required by law to disclose to buyer and seller any known or reasonably ascertainable material facts.
All right. Thank you, Teresa. Okay, and so when it comes to dual agency, it's important, again, to make sure that your client understands all of these things. Notice that it's specifically relating to buyer here. On the seller or the listing agreement, of course, everywhere where it says buyer, it switches to seller, but essentially it's the same, regardless of who your client is. Until dual agency occurs, you're their exclusive agent. But once dual agency begins, they need to understand the difference of, things that you can and can't do when it comes to being a dual agent. Okay, you still have to disclose material facts, but you can't do personal confidential information, things like that. Now, the next section, buyer agrees the firm shall not be liable to the buyer for disclosing material facts required by law to be disclosed and for refusing or failing to disclose other information the law does not require to be disclosed, which could harm or compromise one party's bargaining position, but could benefit the other party. All right, and so it's important to know that the firm and therefore you, the agent, are now protected from certain disclosures if they're not required by law when you are operating under dual agency. So you still have to disclose things like material facts that are required to be disclosed, but other things that you would normally say, you know, personal confidential information, motivations, things like that, you can't disclose it in dual agency. All right. So it then goes to tell what the buyer's new role would be if they are under dual agency. Should the firm become a dual agent, the buyer understands and acknowledges that they have the responsibility of making their own decision as to what terms are to be included in any purchase and sale agreement with a seller of the client of firm. And then the buyer's fully aware and understands the implications and consequences of the firm's dual agency role as expressed herein to provide balanced and fair representation of the buyer and seller and to encourage and effect communication between them rather than as an advocate or exclusive agent or representative. So again, we're saying very clearly, we have to step back. We can kind of facilitate communication, but we can't advocate for either of you. Okay, so that's what the form is saying here. Buyer has determined that the benefits of dual agency outweigh any disadvantages or adverse consequences. And number 4, buyer may seek independent legal counsel to assist the buyer with negotiation and preparation of a purchase and sale agreement or with any matter relating to the transaction, which is the subject matter of a purchase and sale agreement. So if the buyer has some questions or wants some advice that you can't give anymore, remind them that they can have an attorney to assist them with that portion of it if they feel like they need additional assistance there. Should the firm become a dual agent, the buyer waives all claims, damages, loss, expense, or liability other than for violations of North Carolina real estate license law and intentional wrongful acts arising from the firm's role as dual agent. So again, if you're doing something intentionally, if you do something wrong on purpose, you are still going to, you/firm are liable, but otherwise they're waiving claims and damages from operating under dual agency. The buyer shall have the duty to protect the buyer's own interest and should read any purchase and sale agreement carefully to ensure that it accurately sets forth the terms which the buyer wants included in said agreement. If anything, I would say highlight that and read it to your buyers twice. They need to read, you know, these clients these days, they just sign everything. They don't want to read anything. And then they're shocked what they've agreed to later. Make sure you put the importance of reading what they're signing in because they're the ones that are going to be bound to the terms of the agreement. All right. Any questions before we go into designated dual agency?
Question.
Okay.
So it doesn't spell out here whether this is single agent dual agency or two agents dual agency.
It doesn't because that doesn't matter, Judy. In this case, dual agency is dual agency, whether there's one or two. You have to step back and treat both clients fairly. So it doesn't matter if it's one or two.
But it matters, it may matter to the client, right? Whether you as, let's say, a listing agent will practice single agent, dual agency. I mean, most of our clients object to that, where if I say, well, I'm not going to be doing single agent, dual agency, I'll have my buyer's agent represent the buyer if a buyer should come to me directly.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very good. And I'm glad that you mentioned that. That is addressed. It's here. Once we go into the actual authorization, the buyer, if they are concerned about the single agent dual agency, they have the right to authorize that or not. So that's coming. They actually have to check whether they would allow that or not, if that is of importance to the buyer.
See, and for a kind of a nervous seller, I'll offer that up without being asked. I'll say, one thing I won't do is single agent dual agency. So you can be assured that I'm not going to be working with the buyer along with you, seller. And they kind of like that.
And
Yeah.
And that's good, Judy. And some agents decide to run their business that way. And some agents are okay with being a single agent, dual agent. So it's all in how you choose to run your business. If you want to, and I like that and respect that, if you want to offer that up front, you most certainly have the option of doing that. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yep. So great question. But as it pertains to this section here in dual agency, this is the case. This is how dual agency has to be performed, regardless of if it's single or double agent, dual agency. Okay. But the client does have a say, and they actually have to authorize which type even there, which you'll see here in just a second. All right. Now, when we're talking about dual agency, there is another option, and our firm does practice designated dual agency. And so we recommend, when you're working with a client, that you actually offer them this option, because we have the ability to do so. We have a written designated dual agency policy that allows you to be able to offer this to your client. All right. So when a real estate firm represents both the buyer and seller in the same real estate transaction, the firm may, in its discretion, offer designated dual agency. If offered, designated dual agency permits the firm, with the prior express approval of both the buyer and the seller, to designate one or more agents to represent only the interest of the seller, and a different agent to represent only the interest of the buyer, unless prohibited by law. Okay, and there's a note here: an individual agent may not be designated to represent a party in a transaction if that agent has received confidential information concerning the other party in connection with the transaction. So these agents have to be completely neutral. They can't have any other information about the other side. All right. Now, when it comes to that designated dual agency option, remember that allows an agent to operate as if they are exclusive again. And so that would be the best representation option for your client. So you want to make sure that you explain that to them. If you're offering dual agency, you have the ability to offer them designated dual agency, where you could continue to make sure that they are exclusively represented in the transaction. So that's what we recommend as a firm, because we have that option available to our agents, that you really stress the importance of the protection of designated dual agency for your clients. All right. And then the next section here is the actual authorization. So wherever, once you've explained these things, wherever your client feels comfortable, they're going to have to choose. Okay. So the first choice is this first section here, or the exclusive representation. So they can either choose one or the other. They can choose dual, or they can choose to exclusively be represented at all times during the agreement, and they do not authorize dual agency. If your client chooses exclusive representation initially, they can change their mind later, but you will need to make sure to go back and get that in writing if they change their mind and dual agency arises and they want to offer it later. But when they sign, if they pick exclusive, you have to operate accordingly. And it would even be a good idea in the agent only remarks to note that it is an exclusive, in case anyone else in your office wants to potentially show that property. So having it out there from the beginning would help trigger that if it would be a dual agency situation, so you can get the proper permissions before showing a property. Judy.
So this sounds really elementary, but I've always said that, well, I don't know why any seller would ever choose exclusive representation, because aren't you then saying no one else in Keller Williams Central can bring us a buyer?
Yes. It's important for agents to educate their clients and help them to know that that's what they're saying. A lot of people don't understand that that means no one from the firm could bring your buyer. And that's why it's important for you all to understand it, and then for you to educate your clients appropriately. So the best representation in our case would be designated dual agency, but it's important that you understand why and you convey that to your clients.
I mean, is there ever a case where someone would, a seller would choose exclusive representation? Or
Yeah.
a buyer for that matter too? What would be an example?
A lot of times buyers or sellers choose to be exclusively represented if they don't feel confident that they would be represented well if it were ever come to a split situation or a dual situation. Most of the time, it's that they don't really fully understand dual agency or designated dual agency. And there are a lot of firms that don't have the designated option. So in our case, there's really no reason for them not to select designated, but some firms don't have that as an option to offer.
Thank you.
Sure, you're welcome. Any other questions? All right, so if your client does still, after you've explained it all, if they are insistent that they want to be exclusively represented, they would initial here and they would not initial anything in this top section. But if you explain it appropriately and they understand that they will really have exclusive representation under designated dual agency, this is where your client ideally would go ahead and initial from the beginning, okay? But you remember, you have to follow any of their lawful instructions. And so it's up to them what level they feel comfortable, all right? So in order for them to select designated dual agency, they would have to first authorize dual agency. So the buyer authorizes the firm to act as a dual agent representing both the buyer and seller, subject to the terms and conditions set forth in paragraph 14. And then from here, in this case of dual agency, they do or they do not authorize the same individual agent to represent both the buyer and seller in a transaction. So as Judy mentioned, she offers from the get-go that she would not operate in that capacity, and that's perfectly fine if they choose dual agency but not designated. But again, you would ideally want them to just select the designated dual option here, and that way they will still have that exclusive representation. Now, if they do select dual and designated, then what they're saying here, you also initial this if the buyer authorizes designated dual agency. In addition to authorizing the firm to act as a dual, buyer authorizes and directs the firm to designate an individual agent to represent the buyer and a different individual agent to represent the seller. The firm will practice designated dual agency unless designated agency would not be permitted by law due to circumstances existing at the time of the transaction, or the buyer authorizes the firm in writing to remain in dual agency only. Okay, so again, a couple of scenarios like that would be if the other agent knows personal or confidential information ahead of time, and they would not be able to properly represent in a designated dual agency situation. Now, if this comes up in your transaction, then if you need a little bit of assistance or some advice concerning your specific transaction, please don't hesitate to contact the BIC for guidance on how to handle it if there needs to be another person assigned in a designated dual agency situation. But usually it happens that each party already has their own agent. Any questions there?
Melissa's hand is raised.
Melissa, okay.
Dual agency compensation below it.
Mhm.
What verbiage would you prefer to see here?
Okay, great question. Teresa, do you want to talk to the verbiage there?
Sure. So I've seen lots of things in this particular blank. I'm a simple kind of person, so I like simplicity. So we know that the firm prefers 6% if it's a listing. We already know that. That's our policy. That's what we teach. So, and I like the verbiage here. So let's read F, subsection F here, that says dual agency compensation. If the firm acts as a dual agent, including designated agency, the total fee the firm expects to receive. And that right there is the clarifying phrase. we expect as a firm to receive 6% unless otherwise agreed to, you got permission to go down to 5%, or you got permission or agreement from leadership to go less than that. 6%, that's what we expect. So if you want to keep it clean and simple, just put the 6% there. As a buyer's agent, you have no idea what the listing agreement says, but we just know policy is 6%, put it there and it's okay, because that's what we expect to receive. Not definitely what we will receive, but that's what we expect to receive.
So I got a question about that. So I was trained that line gets filled in per seller's listing agreement. So, I mean, I don't know if I'm doing something wrong, but I have cases frequently where there's no agreement at 6%. It might be 5.5 total, or sometimes 5 total. And I've agreed to it. We've come up with how we're going to do that, et cetera. So this would, if I were to fill that in with 6%, now my seller's not going to agree to that because they didn't agree to pay out a total of 6. So by putting in the language per a listing agreement, now I'm agreeing to accept whatever that combination is. I'm agreeing to work with whatever that combination is that the seller set up between their agent and them.
Okay, very, very good, Judy. Good follow-up question. And I love that you're thinking this through. I absolutely love it. This particular one is the buyer agency agreement. So I was speaking to buyer agency, exclusive buyer agency. For the listing agreement, then of course, you're going to put the agreed to compensation that you put on that first or second page, whichever page it is, if it were the listing agreement. That would be, if you agreed to 5.5, it would be the 5.5. So, but this being the buyer agency agreement, and thank you for saying that, so that could be clarified, then for the buyer's agent, 6%. But if you're doing this on the listing agent or listing agreement side, you're going to put in there whatever was agreed to.
Yeah, it's already covered. And so remember, this is what the firm expects to receive. And generally, if the firm is representing both sides, that number the firm would expect to receive is 6%. And notice, Judy, to your point, that's what this next sentence is about here. This will in no way affect or modify the amount of the fee set forth in paragraph 4 above that the firm expects to receive for its services in representing the buyer under this agreement. And so if it says 6% here, but you've agreed to work for the buyer for 2.5% instead of 3%, then that will still be what the buyer is responsible for. And then the seller side, we would only be expecting 3%. So it's an idea here of what the firm would expect to receive as a whole, but it could be different. And that's why that's captured in that writing there. In the event the buyer is interested in purchasing a property where the firm's total fee is different than described in this subparagraph F, the firm shall timely disclose the fee to the buyer and confirm it in writing before the buyer makes or accepts an offer to buy or sell any such property. So if it turns out to be differently, if we find out the listing agent's offering 2.4% or something to that effect, it has to be disclosed in writing to the buyer prior to them making an offer. All right, so it could change, but the amount that's generally expected here is 6% if the firm is representing both sides. So that's just a way to keep it simple here. They're not going to be obligated to that if in fact there's some agreement to work for less. All right. All right, any other questions? That was a great discussion on dual agency, designated dual agency, and how to fill in those sections. Any other questions? All right. Okay, well, I'm looking at the time here. We've only got 10 more minutes, so it looks like we're only going to get through the WWREA WWREA. So we'll have to finish forms in another glad you asked, and that's fine. So the next one that we are going to talk about here is, I'm going to switch screens and take you to the Real Estate Commission's website. And we're going to take a look at the new working with real estate agents disclosure. All right. Can everyone see the WWREA for sellers? Does everybody see that? Great. Okay. All right. Now, this new disclosure form, it was a big deal, about a year ago when it first came out. Well, maybe 6 months ago or something. But anyway, after many years of that brochure, we finally have a much more simplified, easy to use and explain form for working with real estate agents. Notice that there are actually two forms. There's one for sellers and there's one for buyers. And they're used very similarly, but there is one big difference that we'll talk about between sellers and buyers. And so for that purpose, I'm actually going to start with the buyer's form and then back into the seller's form once we talk about what that one difference is. All right. Now, when it comes to this disclosure, remember this form is written right at the top here, you guys, is required for use in all sales transactions, including residential and commercial. Notice that it doesn't say lease transactions. It's not required for lease transactions. It is required in all sales transactions. All right, so make sure that you're aware of that. And now for working with buyers, again, the form is very similar between buyer and seller until we get to the end of the form here. So it's important to know this form is not a contract. Signing the disclosure only means that you've received the disclosure. You have not been hired. Make sure you explain that to your clients so that they would be willing to sign this, even if they choose not to continue with the transaction. In a real estate sales transaction, it's important that you understand whether an agent represents you. Real estate agents are required to, number one, review this form with you at first substantial contact before asking or receiving your confidential information. And number two, give you a copy of it after you sign it. This is for your own protection. Do not share any confidential information with the real estate agent or assume that the agent is acting on your behalf until you've entered into an agreement with the agent to represent you. Otherwise, the agent can share your confidential information with others. That has always been the main point of this disclosure, and it remains that. All right. Now, notice this next section here. This is really important. Who is this note to? What does that say? Note to who?
The
Right?
agent.
You. That's to you guys, right? The note to the agent. This is specifically for you. It's telling you how to fill in this form correctly. Notice it says check all relationship types below that may apply to this buyer. Okay. So now, as a firm, what that means is anything that may apply to the buyer are the types of agency that our firm practices. Okay, which means for every buyer, it could be buyer agency if they do choose that exclusive representation. It could be dual agency, or it could be designated dual agency. These are the only three options that you have in our firm, because this last one here, our firm does not participate in seller sub-agency or working with that unrepresented buyer from the buyer side. Okay. And so with that being the case, since we don't practice seller sub-agency, this is actually not a box that you would check. We would not be able to offer that service to a buyer because we don't practice seller sub-agency. So it's our firm's policy. So it's important for you to know that with every buyer, you should be checking just these first three boxes. Okay. That's really important. So of course it explains here buyer agency. If you agree, the agent who gave you this form and their firm would represent you as a buyer agent and be loyal to you. You may begin with an oral agreement, but your agent must enter into a written buyer agency agreement with you before making a written offer or an oral offer for you. The seller would either be represented by an agent affiliated with a different real estate firm or be unrepresented. Okay, because remember, buyer agency would be exclusive in this case. You would also check dual agency because, again, our firm does and can practice dual, which would occur if you purchase a property listed by the firm that represents you. If you agree, the real estate firm and any agent with the same firm or company would be permitted to represent you and the seller at the same time. A dual agent's loyalty would be divided between you and the seller, but the firm and its agents must treat you and the seller fairly and equally and cannot help you gain an advantage over the other party. I really like that description. I think it's very simple about what dual agency is and how it differs a little bit from designated. So it's a really succinct, well-written description of dual agency. Again, this is a box that you would check because our firm does offer dual agency. And finally, designated dual agency. If you agree, the real estate firm would represent both you and the seller, but the firm would designate one agent to represent you and a different agent to represent the seller. Each designated agent will be loyal only to their client. Any agreement between you and an agent that permits dual agency must be in writing no later than the time you make an offer to purchase. Okay, so it's really important for when it comes to dual agency. Again, you check both boxes because all of these are available to a buyer. All right, now, even though we don't practice seller subagency, we're still going to read this last one, but remember, you don't check it because it's not available to a buyer working with our firm. So seller subagent, the agent who gave you this form may assist you in your purchase, but will not be representing you and has no loyalty to you. The agent will represent the seller. Do not share any confidential information with this agent. So that just explains what it is for an unrepresented buyer. But again, we don't practice seller subagency. Note to buyers, for more information on an agent's duties and services, refer to the Real Estate Commission's Q&A on working with real estate agents brochure, and it tells them where to go. Finally, to finish and complete this form, notice the buyer's signature. You've got to have their name printed or typed, and then the date. Here, you do not have to sign this form. This is important. It's just your name. You just have to have your name, your license number, and the firm's name. It does not require a signature because this is merely a disclosure. Okay, so you're just going to have the name of the agent providing the disclosure. Again, your license number does have to be on the document and the firm's name, but it does not require your signature. So that's something that has confused some agents, and we wanted to make sure that you understand properly how to do the bottom of this form as well. And finally, let's back up just a hair here. When it comes to this disclosure for sellers, again, it's virtually identical to the one for buyer. It has to be used for all sales transactions. We offer, in this case, seller agency, dual agency, designated dual agency, but you could have this last one as well. Okay, so when it comes to sellers, if a buyer agent is working with an unrepresented seller, this one could apply in the event that you're working with a buyer and they want to buy a FSBO. Okay, so you could select this one because that could happen. And if it does happen where you come across a FSBO that your buyer's interested in, then you would need to disclose this form to that seller. And this is the one that you would check off exclusively in that case, because at that point you would not represent the seller. You would be the buyer agent working with an unrepresented seller. So that's the only scenario here where you would check this option. Okay, so making sure that you check all relationship types that may apply to that particular seller. Okay, now in this case, for sale by owner, FSBO, the agent who gave you this form will not be representing you and has no loyalty to you. The agent will represent only the buyer. Do not share any confidential information with this agent. So again, it's important to make sure that it's clear to that unrepresented seller that you don't represent them, that you work exclusively for the buyer. And that's why it's vitally important that you only check this box in that specific scenario. Otherwise, with sellers that you're going to represent, if you're the listing agent, you would select the top three, just like we discussed in the buyer. Any questions about the working with real estate agents disclosures. Well, good. If there's no questions, that means I did good, right? Woohoo! Oh, Mike,
I've got
did you
one.
have one?
You know,
Okay.
I've got one. Okay. So in what situation or what document would we use if we had a seller and a buyer comes in and they don't want representation?
Okay, an unrepresented buyer. Okay, that's a good question, Mike. So again, good point. That one, that could be a scenario. Hold on, let me take you back to the share screen here. I wonder, is that a scenario where you could use that last section in the buyer? Let's take a quick read here. The unrepresented buyer. The agent who gave you this form may assist you in your purchase, but will not be representing you and has no loyalty to you. Okay, Mike, there you go. That scenario, this looks like this could apply. So if you're the listing agent and a buyer comes and does not want representation, that's what this box could be used for. Thank you for mentioning that. So again, these would not be an option for that buyer. It would only be this one option. If a buyer chooses not to be represented, and you will work only for the seller and have no loyalty to that buyer. So do not share any confidential information with this agent. Okay, great question. Thank you for that. So there is a scenario where you could check that box if you're the listing agent and an unrepresented buyer comes and they will not be represented at all. Melissa. Uh-oh. Did you have a question? Okay.
Yeah, so I didn't think we were allowed to do that because of then we don't have errors and omissions insurance to cover the buyer if there were something on the other end.
Okay, so you're not allowed to help an unrepresented buyer buy other properties, but in this scenario, that scenario that Mike asked about, you are the listing agent. So you do have an agency agreement with your seller. And so you're protected through that agency agreement with your seller. And it's important to simply disclose to that buyer that you don't represent them at all. And that's the way that you could disclose that. So you're going to have the E&O protection through your listing agreement with your seller. Okay.
So what couldn't happen as a firm, so if a buyer comes to you, Melissa, and says, nope, don't want you to represent me, and you attempted to refer them off to Mike, and Mike starts to help them and they're ready to make that offer, but then they tell Mike, no, I don't want representation at all. Mike would then be in seller sub-agency, and that's what we don't practice there. So that would apply the unrepresented buyer, but Mike could not assist them because he's the whole, why can't I get it out? Sub-agent of the seller type deal there.
So basically, a buyer should sign a buyer agency agreement and be properly represented. And that's the way that our firm chooses to practice. All right. Well, we thank you all for your time and your attention. I know we covered a lot. There's still several sections of both the buyer agency and the listing agreement that we want to dive into deeper. So I see that we're definitely going to have to continue this in a future GYA. But thank you all for great questions that you've asked, and keep sending in topics and things that you'd like to for us to cover in more detail. Any last questions? We're a little bit over, so we're not going to keep you long, but any burning questions? No? Okay, well, thank you for your time, and we are glad you asked. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.